My name is Dr. Clara Monroe, and I used to believe that some mistakes could be buried deep enough to stop haunting you. I spent 2 years building a life around the simple act of healing, thinking that if I saved enough animals, if I fixed enough broken bones and mended enough torn flesh, I could somehow balance the scales for what I'd helped destroy in another life. I was wrong. The past doesn't stay buried when it has unfinished business, and some ghosts walk on 4 legs, carrying scars that spell out your name in a language only guilt can read. The morning she came into my life, the cold had settled into everything like a living thing determined to leech warmth from the world. Late spring in rural Montana can be cruel that way, promising renewal while delivering frost that kills the early flowers. I'd been at the clinic since before dawn, not because I had emergencies waiting, but because sleep had become something I approached with caution. Dreams had a way of dragging me back to places I'd sworn never to revisit, to laboratories that smelled of antiseptic and ambition, to the sound of my own voice saying things I could never take back. The call came from Henry Garrett, a wheat farmer whose property bordered the national forest. His voice carried that particular strain of confusion that comes when the world presents something that doesn't fit into familiar categories. "Doc Monroe, there's a dog out here. Been standing in the same spot for 3 days now. Won't move, won't eat, won't let anyone get close. She's not aggressive, just scared, like she's remembering something terrible." I should have told him to call animal control. Should have suggested he wait for regular business hours. But something in his voice, some quality of bewildered compassion, made me grab my emergency bag and head out into the gray morning. Maybe I needed to save something that day. Maybe I needed to feel useful in a way that didn't require looking too deeply into my own motivations. The drive to Henry's farm took 27 minutes through rolling hills that had been painted pewter by the dawn mist. When I pulled up to his gate, I could see him standing near his barn, pointing toward a distant corner of his pasture. "She's over there," he called out. "Been watching her through my kitchen window. Something's not right, Doc. The way she holds herself, like she's afraid of her own shadow." I followed his gaze and saw her immediately. A solitary figure standing motionless in the center of an empty field. Even from a distance, there was something otherworldly about her posture, the way she held herself perfectly still while the morning breeze moved the grass around her like water. She was thin, angular, with a coat the color of desert sand and ears that stood alert despite her obvious exhaustion. As I approached, carrying my medical bag and a slip lead, she turned to face me. Her eyes were amber, the kind of deep golden brown that seemed to hold flecks of light even in the gray morning. But it wasn't their color that stopped me cold. It was their expression. These weren't the eyes of a lost pet or even a feral animal. They were the eyes of something that had seen too much, understood too much, remembered too much. "Hey there, girl," I said softly, stopping about 10 feet away. "What are you doing out here all alone?" She didn't respond to my voice, but she didn't retreat either. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. When I took a step closer, she backed away with fluid precision, her movements too controlled, too deliberate for a frightened stray. Each time I extended my hand, she would let out a low whine that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, a sound that spoke of remembered pain rather than present fear. I spent 43 minutes in that field, trying every gentle approach I'd learned in 15 years of veterinary practice. I sat on the ground to make myself less threatening. I offered treats from my emergency kit. I hummed the lullabies I used to sing to my daughter before the accident stole her voice from my life forever. Nothing worked. The dog wanted to trust me. I could see it in her eyes. But something in her body rebelled against human contact, as if it had been programmed to expect pain. Finally, I stopped trying to reach her and simply knelt in the wet grass, speaking in the low, steady voice I'd once used to calm frightened children in the pediatric ward where I'd worked before veterinary school. "It's okay. I won't rush you. We have all the time in the world." Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time seemed suspended in that misty field, as if the whole world had paused to witness whatever was happening between this damaged dog and the damaged woman trying to help her. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, she began to relax. Her rigid posture softened slightly. Her breathing slowed. And then, without warning, she collapsed. Not in surrender, but in pure exhaustion. Her legs simply gave out, as if whatever force had been holding her upright for 3 days had finally depleted itself. I moved quickly but carefully, wrapping her in the emergency blanket I kept in my kit, being extraordinarily careful not to make contact with her legs. For the first time since I'd found her, she didn't flinch at my touch. The drive back to my clinic was silent except for her rapid breathing and the soft sound of my own whispered reassurances. I'd transported hundreds of injured animals over the years, but something about this dog felt different. There was an awareness in her amber eyes that spoke of intelligence far beyond what I'd expect from even the smartest breeds. She watched everything: the dashboard, the road, my hands on the steering wheel. But most unsettling of all, she watched me, as if she were trying to solve some puzzle that only she could see. At the clinic, I settled her into the largest kennel we had, lined it with soft blankets, filled water and food bowls. She ignored everything except the blankets, which she arranged in a precise circle before lying down in the exact center, her body positioned so she could see both the door and the window simultaneously. Strategic positioning, I realized. The kind of awareness that comes from surviving something that required constant vigilance. For the first 24 hours, she refused all food and water. She didn't sleep, just lay there watching everyone who entered the kennel room with those impossibly intelligent eyes. The staff began to whisper about her, the way people do when confronted with something that doesn't fit their understanding of the natural world. "There's something different about her," my assistant Jenny said. "It's like she's not really a dog, like she's something else wearing a dog's body." I began spending my lunch break sitting on the floor outside her kennel, not trying to examine her or coax her to eat, just being present. Gradually, she began to respond to my voice, tilting her head when I spoke, shifting position when I moved. She didn't trust me yet, but she'd stopped seeing me as a threat. Progress, of a sort. On the third day, she finally allowed me to begin a proper examination. What I found defied everything I thought I knew about animal anatomy and physiology. Her legs, all 4 of them, bore identical scars. 4 parallel lines running from her shoulders to her paws, so precise they looked like they'd been made with surgical instruments. But it wasn't the scars that made my hands shake as I examined her. It was what I felt beneath them. Under her fur, embedded like veins in her muscle tissue, were thin filaments that felt nothing like bone or tendon or any biological material I'd ever encountered. They were rigid but flexible, warm but somehow artificial, and they ran in perfect parallel lines from her joints to her extremities. As my fingers traced these impossible structures, a memory surfaced that I'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. I knew this feeling. I'd felt it before, in another life, in a laboratory where I'd been part of a research team developing what they called kinetic enhancement protocols, experimental procedures designed to strengthen and augment the skeletal and muscular systems of test subjects. The project had been classified, buried in budget lines that didn't officially exist, funded by agencies that didn't acknowledge their involvement. I started crying right there in the examination room, my hands still resting on this impossible dog's impossible legs, not because of what I was seeing, but because of what I was remembering. The project had used dogs as test subjects. The procedures had been brutal, invasive, designed to create animals capable of surviving in conditions that would kill normal beings. And I'd been part of it, had helped design the protocols that turned living creatures into something between animal and machine. The project had been shut down after the disappearance of the final test subject, a sandy-coated Saluki mix designated as Unit 04. The official report stated that the subject had died during the procedure, that the experiment was a failure, that all research materials had been destroyed. I'd walked away from that life, moved to Montana, became a rural veterinarian because I needed to heal instead of harm, to save instead of sacrifice. But Unit 04 hadn't died. She was lying in my clinic, watching me with eyes that held recognition and forgiveness, and something that looked disturbingly like hope. I named her Solace, though I wasn't sure whether the name was meant for her or for me. She responded to it immediately, tilting her head and making a soft sound that wasn't quite a whine, wasn't quite a sigh. Over the following days, she began to show signs of trust that felt both precious and undeserved. She would eat if I placed food directly in front of her, though she never took her eyes off me while she did. She would drink water from my cupped hands, but not from a bowl. Most remarkably, she would allow me to sit beside her kennel, even to rest my hand against the wire mesh, as long as I didn't try to touch her legs. At night, when the clinic was empty except for the 2 of us, I would tell her stories. Not the cheerful chatter I usually reserved for anxious animals, but real stories about my life, my losses, my guilt. I told her about my husband David and my daughter Emma, killed by a drunk driver while I was working late at the lab, too obsessed with my research to come home for dinner. I told her about the projects I'd worked on, the animals I'd helped turn into living experiments, the moment I'd realized that my pursuit of scientific advancement had cost me everything that mattered. Solace listened with an attention that seemed almost human. She would tilt her head when my voice broke, move closer to the kennel door when I cried, and once, when I was telling her about Emma's last birthday party, she placed her paw against the wire mesh directly opposite where my hand was resting. For just a moment, separated by metal but connected by something deeper than touch, we shared a kind of peace I hadn't felt since the accident. 2 weeks after I'd found her, a man in a gray suit appeared at my clinic. He carried himself with the particular brand of authority that comes from working for agencies that don't officially exist, and his eyes held the cold calculation I remembered from my research days. He didn't introduce himself, didn't explain how he'd found me, just said he was looking for a missing government asset, and produced a photograph of Solace from his jacket pocket. "She's not missing," I said, my hand instinctively moving toward the kennel room door. "She's recovering from abandonment and trauma." "That animal is classified military property," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "She needs to be returned to appropriate facilities for proper care." Appropriate facilities? The words tasted like acid in my mouth. "You mean the laboratory where you tortured her for months? Where you turned a living creature into a prototype for your weapons research?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise. "Dr. Monroe, you signed confidentiality agreements. This conversation is above your clearance level." I looked at this man who represented everything I'd walked away from, everything I'd tried to atone for by dedicating my life to healing instead of harming, and I felt something crystallize inside my chest. A decision that felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally finding solid ground. "Get out," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "And don't come back." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. But I knew this wasn't over. Men like him didn't give up easily, and assets like Solace weren't abandoned without consequences. That night, I found Solace standing in front of the ultrasound machine in our imaging room. The machine was turned off, unplugged, hadn't been used in 2 days. But the screen was glowing with an image I'd never seen before. A detailed scan of her legs, showing the filament network in impossible detail. At the bottom of the screen, text was blinking. Unit 04, status, recovered. I stared at that screen until my eyes burned, trying to understand what I was seeing, what it meant, how a dog could somehow activate and program medical equipment that required specialized training to operate. When I finally looked away, Solace was sitting beside me, her amber eyes fixed on my face with an expression I could only describe as compassionate. I sank to the floor beside her, and for the first time since I'd found her, she moved closer instead of away. She leaned against me, her warm weight solid and comforting against my side, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since the accident. The presence of my daughter. Not a vision or a voice, just a warmth that surrounded us both. A sense of love that transcended the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the lost. "They did this to you," I whispered into Solace's fur. "I helped them do this to you." She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes, and in that moment, I saw not condemnation, but understanding. She'd survived something that would have destroyed most living things, had somehow retained her capacity for trust and love despite everything that had been done to her. She was stronger than her creators had ever intended, not because of the technology they'd embedded in her body, but because of something they'd never understood and couldn't replicate, the resilience of the spirit. Over the following days, Solace began to show me glimpses of what she was truly capable of. She could run faster than should have been physically possible, her enhanced legs carrying her across the clinic's exercise yard in bounds that seemed to defy gravity. She could sense electrical disturbances before they happened, always moving away from equipment that was about to malfunction. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand complex conversations, responding to nuanced emotional cues in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond what anyone had intended to create. But she was also damaged in ways that broke my heart. She would wake from sleep with soft cries that sounded disturbingly human. She would flinch at sudden movements even from me. And she would never, ever allow anyone to touch her legs, except in moments of deep trust when she would guide my hands to the scars and let me feel the impossible technology that ran through her like artificial veins. 3 weeks after the man in the gray suit had visited, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I closed my clinic, liquidated everything I owned, and bought a small property in northern Canada, where questions weren't asked and government agencies had less reach. Solace and I would disappear together, 2 refugees from a system that treated living beings as expendable resources in pursuit of scientific advancement. The morning we left Montana, Solace did something she'd never done before. As I loaded our supplies into the truck, she approached me and gently took my hand in her mouth. Not biting, just holding. Her teeth carefully positioned around my fingers like she was trying to communicate something words couldn't express. When I looked into her eyes, I saw not just gratitude but purpose. She wasn't just running away with me. She was choosing to trust me with whatever mission had brought her back from the dead. As we drove north through landscapes that grew wilder and more remote with each mile, I thought about the nature of redemption, about whether it's possible to balance the scales for past mistakes by dedicating your future to making different choices. Solace rode beside me, her amber eyes watching the road ahead with the alertness of a sentinel. And I realized that our journey together wasn't about escaping the past. It was about transforming it. She was Unit 04, a failed experiment in military enhancement. But she was also Solace, a being who had chosen love over fear, trust over hatred, hope over despair. And somewhere in the space between those two identities, I found my own path to forgiveness. Not just her forgiveness of me, but my forgiveness of myself. The past wasn't done with us yet. There would be other men in gray suits, other attempts to reclaim what they considered their property. But Solace had survived worse than government agents, and I had finally found something worth protecting with my life. Together, we would write a new ending to a story that had begun in a laboratory filled with screams and would end wherever 2 damaged souls could find peace. She was no longer a prototype or a military asset. She was my partner, my teacher, my path back to the light. And in her amber eyes, I could see the reflection of who I was meant to become. Someone who chose healing over harming, protection over exploitation, love over fear. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in 2 years, I was no longer running from something. I was running toward it, guided by a dog who carried both scars and strength, both trauma and transcendence, in legs that had been designed to destroy but had chosen instead to save.